Hey guys, Eddie back with Couch Talk. Welcome back to the show. If it's your first time with me, welcome to the show. Guys, please hit like, please hit subscribe, turn your notifications on, stick with me, and I promise I will earn your viewership. Today, I wanted to talk about one of the things that I saw in a video online, and it's one of those classic, general educational videos that is supposed to teach the basics behind critical race theory, right? The basics to anyone who's kind of interested into why there are disparities in a lot of different, situations in America, one of which is education, and it is this one that I wanted to focus on today. One of the things that is stated in the video is that there's a disparity of education and access to education because, and this is the reason that it gives the reason that schools are funded, public schools are funded by property taxes, is what it says. And that because there are areas of lower income, that their property taxes are therefore smaller, and that leads to the people that live in those lower income areas having less money to fund their schools. Meanwhile, those who live in high-income areas have more property income taxes to fund their schools. And it would seem like this would make sense, except it's basically a lie. Now, that isn't to say that there aren't some places that are lower income who then have less funding for schools. But there are also, ironically, some places of high income that have less property tax funding to go into schools. And I'll explain why in just a minute. Basically, the whole thing that you really need to understand, if you take nothing else away from this, is that that whole line is a propagandized line. It's BS. It is a way of creating a disparity in your mind where no one necessarily exists. Here's the situation in reality. Firstly, schools are not primarily funded by property taxes. In fact, they're not primarily funded locally at all. They're primarily funded by the state. And they're funded by primarily state income taxes, state sales taxes, and corporate taxes. That is the biggest area that funds schools. That's where the money... By the way, as they do these, they're setting up budgets, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, so it's not like the money from X goes to Y, right? That's not really how it works. What they do is they come up with generally what they think people need, and then they start assigning money based on what they think they're going to get, right? So it's not like they see small amounts of money coming in here and therefore only attribute small amounts of money somewhere else. That's not how it works. How it works is they have a school, they figure it's going to need this much, and then they go find it, right? We'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But first I want to talk about the specific claim that property taxes comprise the disparity in education. They do not. So first of all, they're not even the bulk of what goes into schools. They are a minority as to what goes into schools. And also, in addition to state, sales tax, state corporate tax, state income taxes, on top of that, there's also federal funding, which, by the way, goes specifically to the schools in greatest need. So even if there were a disparity generated by a slight property tax differential, the federal taxes should compensate for it. Now, another thing to consider is this, and I started doing some research into this particular claim, and I learned something else that was interesting, and that is that this general assumption that lower income areas have lower property taxes is also a falsehood. Because if you think about the high income areas, right? Like the people that make them, think about in your mind the people that make the most money. They've got that nice 8-room mansion on the hill, but they have a hill. They have several acres of land. They own a lake, right? So pound for pound, the value of their property, sure, it probably is $2-3 million. It's a gorgeous house. It's a nice yard. But if you go down to a low income section, you're fitting 8 or 10 houses in the same area. As a matter of fact, if you go into the lowest income area, where you get into like Section 8 housing, you're essentially working off apartments. You're essentially working off like government-run apartments that, while they're relatively cheap to live in, rent month over month, especially if they're subsidized by the government. But apartments are not cheap, property value-wise, right? Property value-wise, if you've got a 75-unit construction, a 75-unit structure that holds 75 residences, and it's over the course of, 2 acres of land, 3 acres of land, it's basic. You're talking about the difference between a mansion and a 75-room apartment. The apartment's more expensive, right? Not only that, the lowest income zones are actually inner city, right? Usually. Not always, but usually they're inner city. And guys, businesses cost a ton, especially when you have like, low high-rise businesses like that are 2-3 stories, or like little office buildings, because they're relatively in a cheap area, but they're still vastly more expensive. Number one, being in city, and number two, being, tightly packed, right? That's why New York City is so expensive, is because everything is so tightly packed, right? So the lower income you go, you actually sometimes have higher property taxes, right? Now, what I'm not trying to tell you that it will always be that you will have higher property taxes from a lower income section. That's not what I'm trying to tell you. What I'm telling you is it's all over the board. And I looked at, looked like 20, 30 different places online just to try to get averages for myself, because I didn't necessarily trust what I was seeing. And I got averages all over the place. Like, I saw this one spot that was, in my estimation, the lowest income level, pound per pound, like as far as number of people that would fit there to live reasonably, or were expected to live there, right? Like if you look at a nice 8-room mansion on a hill zone, I expect, 5 or 6 or maybe even 7 or 8 people living there. I'm not expecting, it to be one person per room, but maybe there is, like maybe it's a frat house or something, right? There's different situations. There's a ton of different situations, all of which are completely unknown to us, right? These factors are so vast, so complex, so numerous, and so intricate that we could not possibly make the claim that is made in this video with any accuracy whatsoever. But the ones that I saw that I felt were the lowest income actually averaged, I think it was the 3rd highest property tax value per acre, per like square foot, right? So that doesn't make any sense with relationship to this movie. So if you think that this video tells you that just if you live in a low income area, you're not going to get access to good education, that's not actually the case at all. Not only that, in schools that have like high populations, high concentrations of people, because there's a lot of people that live in a small area, the real problem is that there isn't enough interest in the educational resources. And this is something that goes back to what I've been saying from the very beginning. The number one impact on whether or not someone gets ahead in this world is their own choice, right? Let's take my situation, for example. And I'm not using myself as a statistic. I'm just giving you an example of what could take place, right? I lived in a low-income area, and I think my school was not the lowest income area, not the lowest income school, but it was probably the 2nd lowest income area of the schools in my city, schools in my county. And I had a nice school. It had more computers, actually, than any other school in the district. But that was largely because we were a little bit bigger than most of the other schools too. But we had a lot more computers. Like as far as educational resources, we had a nice library. We had some great stuff. Now the thing was though, is when you went down to the computer lab, when you went over to the library, there was nobody in there. nobody ever used those resources. It wasn't a question of, do we have it or not? It was a question of, do we have it available for someone who wishes to use it? And the answer was most certainly yes. The problem was nobody tried to. Nobody was really given that. I mean, yeah, there were a couple of people. Well, I was one of them, right? I was into computers. As a matter of fact, I used that to go to NC State for computer programming at when it was time. That was what I was interested in. But there were resources available to me, despite the low income zone that I was in, despite the racial status of my area, which was predominantly African American, which there's nothing wrong with it. Despite that, there were plenty of educational resources available. All right, so it was not you. Nobody who went to my schools could ever make the claim that because they were a minority or because they were poor, that they didn't have access to educational resources. 100% did, and this is a low-income city in a low-income part of that city, okay, with high crime rates. But the educational resources were 100% available. But that's just one example, right? But I'm showing you statistically it's not accurate either. Statistically, it's all over the board. Property taxes could be all over the board, not having anything to do with necessarily what your income level is, right? It could be anywhere. Now, that isn't to say that there aren't disparities, right? For example, Utah, where the cost of living is low, they usually attribute like $3-4 grand per student. Whereas opposed to New York and California, where the cost of living is very high, they attribute like $10,000 and $11,000 per student. Now, those disparities are on a cost of living level, and I don't know that they're fair. I would have to do more research to figure that out. I can tell you that it does strike me odd that it's that different. I don't know enough about the cost of living differences in those areas or the resource cost differences in those areas to know if that's fair. I don't really know. And there's some other really bad, never forget the fact that the school boards usually control the funding, and so how they spend is, they're human. They're going to spend imperfectly, just as all humans will. And just like many other things that involve money, really, it's good managers, good leaders will do better, right? So that you might get lucky and be in a school board where they spend very efficiently, very effectively, where they, find the right deals and their money goes a long way. Or you might find somebody who really doesn't give a shit, and then you could be screwed. Even if you're in a great area, you just might find or you might find somebody who's embezzling or something. There's a million different things that could happen. But ultimately, it is not due to race. It is not due to gender. It is not due to economic status, even. What it's due to is almost luck at that point, right? You're basically looking at a lot of different possibilities. So I just want you to see that these are some of the factors that go into the differential of education in the area. But I guarantee you guys, I'm telling you, coming up in one of the lowest income areas with one of the highest crime rates in a city that had, just to give you an idea, the year that I graduated high school, I think Durham had 60 homicides. 60. Right? To give you an idea, LA had 220. And Durham is nowhere fucking near a quarter of the size of LA. Not even close. Right? So, that's just to give you an idea. And Durham wasn't known for homicides. It was known for its drugs and its theft. That's what it was known for. Drugs and, burglary. Drugs and, robberies. Okay? So, that's just to give you an idea of what I grew up in, and that didn't stop me, and it shouldn't have stopped anybody in my area. Now, did it stop some people? Sure, yeah. Some people make bad decisions, and some people will not ever get out of that area, and it's not because they couldn't, and it's not because they didn't have the resources available to them. Some people have really bad strokes of luck. And sometimes that's, out of our control. And sometimes, and it really doesn't have anything to do with race, right? I've seen from one guy to the next, it could be what guy one does everything right and he can't get out. He can't break free. Guy, guy B does, most things wrong and does one thing right, and that one thing just catapults him into the stratosphere. It's really, there's a lot that goes into, breaking out of your wealth zone to get to the next level. Most of it isn't inheritance. We're going to talk about that in a future video. That's one of the other classic claims of critical race theory, is that basically if your grandparents were rich, then your parents were rich and you're going to be rich. Well, boy, do I wish that were true, because my great-grandparents were very rich. They came over here with nothing and they built an empire, and I didn't see any of it. Why? Again, it was luck. All right, so we'll talk about that a little bit more later. Guys, I'm interested to hear what you have to think about this, what you have to say. But you can see, for the various reasons that I mentioned, and I'll post some of my sources where I give you some of the breakdowns of where this funding comes from. It is not predominantly property tax. And even when it is property taxes, being in a low-income zone does not mean less money for schools. They make it sound like it does because you think low income, low money. But that's not how it works, right? Because the amount of money in the zone is still possibly more than in the zone of high-income people. So that's just how it works, guys. But we'll talk about this some more on Couch Talk. I'll catch y'all next time.